Hi, everyone, and welcome to a really, really special lecture. It's the Stern Family Lecture on Israel Studies. And it's my dutiful pleasure to introduce the inaugural holder of the Dr. Saul Philip Wax Chair of Jewish Life and Learning, Professor Brendan Goldman, this is the launch of a series which introduces our new executive Ph.D. in Jewish Studies. This is the years, truly, of work to get to this moment. And there's really been no better steward than Professor Goldman. And so it is really terrific to hand over the baton to the steward of all of this. Brendan, welcome to Gratz. Welcome. Still say welcome to Gratz. And Brendan is really poised to be one of the formative leaders and champions of all the special things that we're doing at Gratz. Looking forward.
Thank you, President Aleph, and that generous introduction. I could not be more excited to be here. Before I turn the floor over to Professor Roby, I would like to say a few words about my new position at Gratz, as well as the new executive PhD in Jewish Studies. I'm privileged to hold the Saul P. Wax Chair in Jewish Life and Learning at Gratz. This newly established position and the support of Gratz College leadership, faculty, and staff has allowed me to take the lead in reinvigorating Jewish studies at Gratz, the oldest independent college dedicated to this discipline on this continent. This task has involved establishing a new executive PhD in Jewish studies, the first degree program of its kind dedicated to training a new generation of public scholars and leaders in the Jewish world, including rabbis, educators, nonprofit directors, and public policy influencers. We seek to elevate contemporary Jewish leadership through rigorous training in doctoral caliber research and writing skills, and to foster the ability to translate and inculcate Jewish wisdom for the general public. Through the generous support of the Walder Foundation and our alumnus, Gene Hoffman, we have been able to recruit an exceptional cohort of 30 students from across the United States, the UK, South Africa, and Israel. These students will begin their studies at Gratz at the beginning of May. Many are joining us for the talk today. I will be happy to field any questions you may have about the program if you wish to contact me. And now on to our lecture. As President Aleph mentioned, the Stern Family Lecture on Israel Studies is the realization of the vision of the late Harry Stern. With the generous endowment he established over 30 years ago, Gratz College is able to bring outstanding scholarly lectures to the community each year. I would like to thank his son, Jerry Stern, and his wife, Marilyn, for their continued engagement with Gratz. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bryan Roby as the 2025 Stern Lecturer at Gratz College. Dr. Roby is an associate professor of Jewish and Middle Eastern history at the University of Michigan. His research focuses on the history of race and racism, Black diasporas, and Jewish identity in the Near East from the 19th century to the present. His first book, The Mizrahi Era of Rebellion, Israel's Forgotten Civil Rights Struggle, 1948 to 1966, provides an extensive history of social justice protests by Middle Eastern Jews in Israel. His current book project, Blackness Refracted, Race in the Making of the Jewish Color Line in the 20th Century, traces the migration history of racialized peoples and ideas across seas and oceans throughout the global 20th century. The book examines how early 20th century European scholarship constructed Afro-Asian Jews, or Mizrahim, as Black, and how in the second half of the 20th century, Afro-Asian Jews responded to this interpolation within Israel, Asia, and Africa. It explores the histories of the Israeli Black Panthers, Indian Jewish civil rights activism, and Ethiopian Jewish migration to Israel. Professor Roby's talk today on global Blackness and Yemenite and Ethiopian poetry in Israel draws on his research for the second book project. Thank you all. It's a privilege to introduce Dr. Roby, who also did us the significant favor of speaking to our doctoral students before this talk, and I couldn't be happier to have him as the person who speaks at my inaugural event at Gratz. So thank you again, and Professor Roby will speak, and then at the end we will field questions. I'll ask a few questions, and then please submit your questions to the Q&A. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Professor Goldman, for having me here, and thanks to the Stern family for writing for this lecture. I just need a moment while I reshare my screen, and I will be right with you. There we go. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about Blackness in Israel. And usually when we talk about kind of, particularly within the Jewish context, the Israeli Jewish context, usually the term Mizrahi is used, which means Oriental or Easterners. But I've kind of developed a new terminology, at least in English, which I think makes a lot more sense, which is Afro-Asian Israeli Jews. And that's primarily to look at how um, they are the community of peoples that I'll talk about are not just kind of within this vacuum of Israeli society, but very much related to global histories in and outside of the Israeli context. So what I'll do is kind of walk you through some of my book, which deals with how they were interpreted or understood to be Black within the Zionist movement, within Israeli society, and then how they embrace that kind of designation and use it to this day to actually understand themselves, understand their struggles within Israeli society. I'll conclude with kind of talking a little bit about the Black Lives Matter movement within Israeli society, particularly amongst Ethiopian Israeli Jews. And then if there's time, I'll read a little bit of poetry from the person at the top right-hand corner, Yossi Zabari, who deals with these questions of Blackness, particularly for the Yemenite Israeli community and Ethiopian Israelis. Okay, so when we talk about Afro-Asian or Mizrahi communities, it's really important I like to, I'm a very visual person, so I like to give this kind of little map that I created. Not well color-coded. I am colorblind, so I struggled a little bit with that one. But what this is each circle is different Jewish communities, different cities that had large-scale Jewish communities over a long period of time. So we see as far as east within Morocco, there's a lot more in the south, but they're much smaller towns from Morocco. And we also have Sudan, Egypt, as far north as Turkey, Istanbul, and the Balkan regions, as well as Yemen, as far east to as India. Whoops. India as well, and as well as Singapore, which is kind of harder to see there, that dot there. But this is what we're talking about when we're talking about Mizrahi or Afro-Asian communities, is that I really want to drill down that it is a very, very diverse community of Jews, linguistically, culturally, historically, geographically. They're kind of all put together within this kind of non-European designation within Israeli society. Okay, so how do we understand race within the Israeli Jewish context? There are kind of three main racial groups or racial groupings within Israeli society. The first being Ashkenazim, which you may be familiar with this term. It refers, this is kind of the white community of Israeli Jews. It refers to European origin Jews who have historically and continue to maintain the political and socioeconomic power of the state. When people imagine, when they say, oh, I'm Israeli, this is kind of like the normative framework of understanding Israeli identity through an Ashkenazi or European origin Jewish lens. And then we have Mizrahim, who historically were the Black community of Jews. As I point out, it's a diverse group of Jews from Africa and Asia, most of whom migrated from the 1950s until the 1970s. But as with many and all Jewish communities that live within Israel, they, of course, were there before the state as well, with a large contingent of Yemenite Jews from the 1800s, other Sephardic Jewish communities as well, who sometimes are put within the category of Mizrahim, but not always. Um, and yeah, and then the third community are the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jewish community, Ethiopian origin Jewish community, most of whom migrated in the late 70s to the early 90s. There are still some migrations of Jews nowadays, but a lot less. And I put here black and question mark because prior to their migration to Israel, most were not, would not consider themselves black. That has to do with the fact that in Ethiopia, there are several different racial categories, from black and red and brown, yellow and green. And with red being at the top of the hierarchy in a sense. And most of the Jewish community being associated with the Amharic ethnic group, which is red, they would mostly be red. And so it was very confusing for the first generation of those who came in the 70s to the 90s of being called Black. And it's like, what do you mean? This is not how, it doesn't make sense to them. But then by the second generation, the youth, in a sense, kind of understood a more global Blackness, which is what I'll get into shortly. In addition to that, we have other Black communities, so really non-Jewish Black communities of asylum seekers, many of whom are also from East Africa, but some also from West Africa as well. We have the small community of Black Hebrew Israelites in the south of the country. These are a non-Jewish community of Black Americans from Chicago and Philadelphia, mostly, who migrated to the state of Israel in 1969, and have a really rich and colorful history of their residency in Israel. But they would be considered also kind of this part of the Black community within Israeli society. Um, Also, you have Afro-Palestinians and Afro-origin Bedouins. The Afro-Palestinian community are a lot of them migrated to Ottoman Palestine on their way to Mecca during Hajj, either from the 1600s up until the 1800s and 1900s as well. And then but remained with the Palestinian Arab community and integrated amongst them. And then the same with the Afro-Bedouin community. And then there's also the kafala system, which is present throughout the Levant. So Syria, less so nowadays, but Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan as well have this kind of system in place where there are domestic migrant laborers, many of which are quite marginalized and oppressed. But today, mostly, almost exclusively talking about the kind of Black Jewish community within Israel. So how do we understand Blackness as scholars of race? It's important that we not kind of think about Blackness just as something located on the body. One, because of diversity, and I'm quoting here Michelle Wright from her book, Physics of Blackness. One, because Blackness can't be located on the body. There's a diversity of bodies that claim Blackness as an identity. And more importantly, when we try to locate Blackness on the body, we often kind of fall into what we call biological determinism, where we imagine that someone's essence, okay, we can measure someone's race based on the amount of blood that they have in this, or the shape of their nose, the shape of their head, which really reproduces both anti-Semitic and anti-Black racist science from the 19th and early 20th century that, as scholars, most of the time we don't want to reproduce that type of ideology. On the left-hand side is a nice picture of a group called 30 Shades of Black. It's an Afro-feminist march that happens in France on occasion, in Paris in particular, where Black women have a marching band and they march through the streets, and it's Black women from a diversity of countries of origin, also ways that they understand their Blackness and their femininity as well. So I thought it was a nice kind of imagery of that idea of global Blackness. So one of the questions that I'm getting at within my second book project, Blackness Refracted, is how did this come about? How, on one hand, did you all of a sudden have this diverse community of people kind of lumped all together? And then how were they associated with Blackness within the Jewish framework? It doesn't quite make sense if you really think about it. How much, if we think about Morocco and India, Morocco and Singapore, Morocco and Iraq, how much do they really have kind of cultural relations with each other? Not much, but then they're placed within this Mizrahi category within Israeli society. And so what I found is that it really starts with early 20th century and late 19th century European travel writers who are going to these countries, meeting some Jews and saying, oh, yeah, this is who I met. This is what the Jews are like there. Some of them reproducing anti-Semitism onto the native Jewish communities that they encountered. some of them kind of creating fanciful tales of, things that may or may not have happened, but creating an image of the Jewish community within colonized places within the global South. After that occurs, you also have later by the 1910s and 1920s, you have the Zionist movement engagement with what's called scientific racism. And so here I put in four figures who are very crucial to kind of creating an image of the Oriental Jew, or in their case, sometimes they will refer to them as the Black Jew. And Arthur Rupin, who was kind of infamous and famous as well, was a German Jewish social Darwinist. He is also foundational to Jewish demography. So if you think about questions of where did the Jewish continuity crisis come from, how do we understand, how do we count Jews nowadays within surveys and things like this, this is really kind of Arthur Rupin's brainchild, or child in a sense. The other who I'll talk about briefly is Nahum Shalush, who was a ethnohistorian, archaeologist, and French colonial spy. He's a fascinating character for a number of different reasons. One, just because he did a lot of different jobs all at once. He was also a professor while he was doing all four of those jobs that I just mentioned, and a travel writer. In one of his books, Travels in North Africa, is actually where a lot of the stereotypes about North African Jews are derived within Israeli society. His cousin, Yitzhak Ben Zvi, was also an ethnographer, has a whole institution named after him. He was an ethnographer of Jews in Mandate, Palestine, and then later became the second president of Israel. And lastly, Shlomo Goitin, who I won't talk about today, was a German ethnographer of Jews in the Arabian Peninsula. These four figures somehow became responsible for writing the entire kind of identity, cultural history of large swaths of the Jewish community, particularly within what is now deemed as the Mizrahi community within Israel. So just four people wrote entire histories of entire peoples. The Homshalus. And so they feature less so Ben Zvi and Goitim, but Rupin and Shalush in particular feature as kind of villains in my story in some ways. And you'll see why in a second. So the Shalush worked as an ethnographer. He was getting his Ph.D., finished it, continued working at the Sorbonne, and then went on a quest of sorts. At that time, he was working on behalf of who then became the French colonial resident general of Morocco, Lyoté, General Lyoté, but also working for the Jewish Territorial Organization, which was a Zionist movement, part of the Zionist movement prior to the decision that Palestine would be decided as the political homeland for, or safe haven for, Jews. Prior to that, this is around 1912 to 1914, there was a lot of kind of like back and forth of whether or not Palestine would actually really work. There was questions about, oh, it's kind of small, this isn't really a great place to live, and people will never go for it, so maybe we should look elsewhere. He was part of that effort of looking elsewhere. One of his main things was that Libya, in particular, should be the site for where a Jewish state should be built. That was never really followed through, but he did do these scientific missions, in which later became his book, Travels in North Africa. While he was there, in his book, he wrote about kind of encountering and in a sense almost discovering Libyan Jews, which is a very strange thing given that they've lived in Libya for thousands of years. And he created this notion that it was Africa was a could be created as a homeland for the Jewish people, particularly Libya and maybe East Africa. And in creating that kind of myth, he created a lot of myths around it. So the idea that Africa was just waiting, or Libya was just waiting for a Jewish state, in that sense that, prior to um, the Arab conquests of North Africa, there were Greeks and Romans, and none of them were really great at kind of like developing that land. And he wrote, it is as if though they were waiting for its valiant Jewish aboriginals. Although he really liked the land of Libya as a potential state, he did not like Libyan Jewish people at all. He had really nasty descriptions of the community. Here I have a quote here where he described going to Amrus, a town with a large Jewish population near Benghazi, where he says that he tried to avoid, quote, the little brown girls half naked, their black eyes flashed out of black circles composed of flies that clung to them without causing them any discomfort. This is the scourge of the African Jew caused by his disregard of cleanliness and by constant exposure to sand and stun. While it may seem like a throwaway kind of racist comment, the impact of this, particularly in his book, he talks about Moroccan Jews as like carrying out blood vendettas and walking around with knives and being scary and things like that. The stereotypes that he wrote about actually became stereotypes within the Yishuv and then later within the state of Israel, where you have this phrase kind of Marokkai Sakin. It does come directly. I tried to trace where does that come from. It comes from Seloush's book and his writings, as well as this idea that North African Jews were prone to eye infections, contagious eye infections. That stereotype actually prevented their immigration a lot of times. There was a selective immigration policy in place, and a lot of Jews from North Africa were kind of prevented from migrating to Israel and Mandate Palestine because of what he wrote about them. So what I refer to in this case is kind of a violence of the pen, the ability of scholars and scholarship to actually do a lot of harm. And we actually do need to be quite careful about how we write about people. The other figure is Jacques Feitlevich, not so much a villain, kind of an ambivalent figure in my book. He is written about as if he is the father, he's called the father of Ethiopian Jews. Or even a discoverer of Ethiopian Jews. Jews in Ethiopia have been around for, again, thousands of years. But he was one of the first modern European Jews to really have a detailed interaction with the community. And the way he wrote about them, although he was really trying to advocate for the community, both for the Zionist movement and also for French colonial society, was somewhat problematic. He oftentimes kind of questioned their Jewishness, and it's mostly because of their lack of whiteness in his eyes. So we have a quote here from 1905 where he refers to them as falashas. It is considered a derogatory term, but for him, he may not have been aware of that at the time. It's what Christians call Jews as strangers. He says that the Falashas say that they belong to the Jewish race, but their African color appears to contradict this. And so in this short quote, we both see kind of a fashioning of Jewishness as whiteness, but also kind of a denial of the possibility of Black Jewishness in that sense. Um, on top of that, in another part of the writing, he notes that their isolation for thousands of years from co-religionists, meaning other Jews in other parts of the world, these Jews living in the very heart of the populations of this gigantic country of Africa. Of course, we were aware that Africa is not a country, it's a continent. But in addition, he kind of creates this stereotype of Ethiopian Jews being kind of isolated completely from the entirety of the world, the entirety of the Jewish world at that, which was not true. We have, documentation that the Jewish community of Ethiopia were in direct contact with a number of different Jewish communities, at least from the 1300s, both in Europe and other parts of Africa, and also in the Arabian Peninsula, current-day Yemen. So this wasn't quite true, but it created a notion, and because he was fashioned as the main expert or the only expert of the Jewish community there, this was kind of taken, without a grain of salt, just kind of like, yeah, all right, that makes sense. They were isolated. I never heard of them, so they must not really have existed prior to that. The impact of this was quite great. The state of Israel, when it was founded in 1948, went back and forth and really kind of questioned their Jewish status of Ethiopian Jews. And it wasn't until 1975 in which Rav Ovadia Yosef, the chief Sephardic rabbi, recognized their official status as Jews, And this, interestingly enough, was actually done in part through the advocacy work of a Yemenite origin Ethiopian Israeli, a man, Hazi Ovadia, who was from Yemen, but because there was a lot of back and forth between Yemen, Eritrea, and Ethiopia of the Jewish community, that he had grew up in Ethiopia and really wanted to advocate for the native population there. And so he did so once he was able to migrate to Israel as a Yemenite Jew. Okay. Um, and here I have here just kind of like showing this triangulation of racial constructs. An English language book produced in New York by Morris Fishberg. Was a Polish origin American Jewish scholar who wrote this book, The Jews, A Study of Race and Environment. Through this, he uses all of the figures I mentioned at the top here, Arthur Rupin, Ham Shalosh, Yitzhak Ben Zvi, Shlomo Goiten, to kind of create a mapping of what are the different races of the Jews throughout the world. And in his point, what he wanted to do in writing this was to show that Jews were racially diverse, but to the extent that they were also able to adapt to whatever kind of societal context that they lived in. And his main thing was to advocate for the Jewish community as part of within the U.S. as white and American, and so that even though they are racially diverse, you can find Jews in Africa and Asia, that they're still capable of civilization, more or less. And so in order to do that, he kind of juxtaposed European origin Jews to non-European origin Jews. And we see here on the right-hand side his picture of a woman in a beautiful kind of dress taking a studio photo where he designates her, of course, or kind of puts in the caption that she's a fat Jewess in Tunis in native costume. And so it creates this image. So not just a kind of literary image, but a physical image where photos and pictures of people of Jewish communities are kind of manipulated to tell a specific type of story that may not be true. So in my first book, what I talked about is what happened in the 1950s and 60s and 70s with Jews who migrated from the Middle East to North Africa. And one thing that I'll say about it is that it's about the time in the Mabarot, or the transit camps, which were meant to be, they were these tent camps. Sometimes they were shacks. People, Jewish migrants who were coming to the state of Israel to live, were placed there meant to be for just a week or two, sometimes a few months. And what would happen is that a lot of times European origin Jews, or Ashkenazim, would live there for like a week, while Mizrahi Jews were kept there for months and then years, and sometimes over a decade. In my research recently, I've discovered that the last Maborah was dismantled in the 1980s, actually. And so these were meant to be just, for like up for a year. Of course, a lot of the Maborot were between so they were established in 1949, but then by 1952, 1953, many of them were turned from tent camps into tent shacks, but still were meant to be very transitional kind of living. Those tent shacks were then turned into development towns that are still impoverished to this day. So what I did was create a map here, you can see, of where all of the Mabarot were in the 1950s. And then upon recent data that I received from the Census and Housing Bureau of the State of Israel, I um, used an overlapping map that you don't see here, where I tried to figure out, okay, well, has there been a lot of social mobility since the 1950s? And what I found is that if I disaggregated for Afro origin Jews and where they are mostly densely populated, it maps on almost perfectly to where the Mabarot or these transit camps were. And so what that tells me is that there hasn't been that much social mobility, and there's actually been quite a bit of kind of like residential segregation in some ways. When we look at where mostly European origin Jews live in the 21st century, we see mostly where the Mabarot were not, which were Tel Aviv, some wealthier parts of Jerusalem. And there's some interesting results when I looked at American origin Jews, which I can get into in the Q&A if someone's interested in that. Okay, so the story prior to my first book was that, yes, the transit camps were really bad. People were very bitter about it, but they didn't complain too much. And what I wanted to prove, and I did quite effectively, was that people did complain quite a lot, actually, for decades. And there were protests against the government. There were protests by Mizrahi Jews for things like gender equality, labor rights, the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel, who were then living under military rule. And then, most importantly, it kind of coalesced into a much more cohesive community. Keep in mind that in the first years or so, people don't necessarily speak the same language. If they're coming from the Arab-speaking world or from an Indian-speaking community and things like that, they don't necessarily talk. They can't necessarily talk to each other, except for in Hebrew, which they are still learning. What I found fascinating in this first book project was that a lot of times they would turn to the Black American experience actually to understand their own experience. And so we have in 1965, that's conveniently for me written in English, although I do, write and speak Hebrew. It's just really great. You don't have to translate a lot of the terms that they use. Um, where a letter to the editors talking about a protest that's occurring in the 1960s. And he uses like very kind of American frames of reference in order to understand what Mizrahim are going through. And so he says, the days are over when the Orientals, meaning Mizrahim, would gratefully thank their European masters for any little morsel thrown to them in the form of another Uncle Tom in the Knesset. And Uncle Tom, of course, is a reference to Uncle Tom's Cabin and how it's used in the U.S. today. There is growing instead the feeling that we don't want any favors, but rather demand what is ours by right, meaning equality. Whiteism breeds blackism, and it's really a really kind of clarion or warning call to Israeli society that if this kind of divide between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim continues, it'll really create racial friction and racial division between Jews, which is kind of what happened in some ways by the 1970s. So I want to turn a little bit to the Black Panthers in Israel, and to give a little bit of context. Of course, we have the establishment of the Black Panthers in the U.S. In the 1960s by student groups in California and Oakland and Chicago. But then we have various other Black Panther movements throughout the 1970s in wildly different cultural and geographical contexts. And so we have first the British Black Panthers, established in 1968 to 1973. And this is a group of people who are coming from either the Caribbean or they're Black British, meaning that they may have been formerly enslaved Black British people or from a different part of the British Empire. They're also South Asians, either coming from India, Pakistan, or they're coming from East Africa, or they're coming from the Caribbean. And so this is really a large, diverse group of generally Black and South Asian community members who are coming together in what's called political blackness. And they form the British Black Panthers. Following that, you have the Israeli Black Panthers in 1971. It's primarily Moroccan and Iraqi Jewish youth. The Polynesian Panthers in 1971, and then the Dalit Panthers. Dalits are what is colloquially known in English as the untouchable caste, who were formed in 1972. The Dalit and the Polynesian Panthers still exist to this day. On the top right-hand side is one of their recent symbols of the Dalit Panthers. And so the protests of the Israeli Black Panthers are quite powerful, and it kind of shakes up the country in many ways. There's a lot of support from the American Jewish population, as well as some critiques from the American Jewish population, as well as the French Jewish population, where it really shed light on what is going on amongst Jews or between Jews within Israeli society. And it shakes up that notion that it's just a unified community. Everybody looks and acts the same and everything's okay. On the left-hand side, we can see the kind of appropriation of the Black Power fist in the middle. And then what you're seeing, those two things that people are holding up are two coffins. One, which is labeled discrimination, afleya, the other gizanut, racism, and so they are symbolically burying racism and discrimination within the country, or trying to, in a sense. And on the right-hand side is the Black Panthers. It's a journal issue from Mutt's Pen with their symbol of a Black Panther. We can see here how people are kind of integrating or using various different symbolisms of global Black power struggles for their own purposes there. So I want to get into the legacy, and then I'll move to Ethiopian Jews. And what I want to point out is that the Israeli Black Panther legacy is really powerful. It's still, is a part of the Israeli memory to this day. Unfortunately, many of the members have passed away in recent years. Reuven Abershil, of course, is still alive, thankfully. But even in the 1970s, there was this, late 1970s, there was this case of hundreds of Moroccan Jewish families who are kind of threatening the state to leave and migrate back to Morocco. And a news reporter asked them, why? Why would you do that? Wouldn't you want to live in a Jewish state rather than, a Muslim state under a king? And this person kind of pointed out that, 28 years we put up with you Ashkenazim, and we didn't become affluent from the Black Panthers protest and Wadi Salib protest that the Blacks did against the whites. So now we're saying, thanks, that's enough. We're going back to Morocco. And so even in like other forms of protest, this person isn't necessarily a Black Panther member. He's just thinking of how that framework really helped him really articulate why he wanted to leave the country. And so we have this general sense of like, what are Black forms of protest within Israeli Jewish context? And I think there's three of them. One is this out-migration that does occur. Most prominently in the 1970s, there was out-migration to Europe, the Americas, Morocco, and Iraq. Ethnic-based parties, which started in the 70s and kind of ended with the Shas Party in the 1980s, Tami and Black Panthers as well. And then also institution building of the Mizrahi Democratic Rainbow, which is kind of loosely titled after the Push Rainbow Coalition. Jesse Jackson, Hila, which is the educational institution that works with Ethiopian origin, Bedouin, and Mizrahi families to help them get a better education, and cultural revival movements. Moving on to the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jewish community. So a little bit of background is that Feitlevich, in addition to kind of studying the communities that of Ethiopia and Eritrea, also would send a lot of the younger boys to live with European families. And this is in the early 20th century. And then once they finished their education there, he would then send them back to Ethiopia. Once the state of Israel was created, he continued this practice, but in Israel. And so throughout the 1950s, there is an early community of youth who were educated at Kfar Batya, and then sent back to Ethiopia. Some of them, were Zionists and they wanted to stay in the country, but again, because of a sort of refusal to recognize their Jewish status, they were not able to. Some of them had to live in the country illegally, and sometimes face deportation because of that. In 1974, we have the start of the Derg Civil War that lasted until 1991. This is where the emperor of the last emperor of the Solomon dynasty, Haile Selassie, was deposed, and then a military junta was put in place. This led to the death of thousands of people in that 20-year process. And in 1984 to 1985, there was widespread man-made famine in Ethiopia. This disproportionately affected the Jewish community, many of whom were farmers or relied on agriculture for their sustenance. Thank you. There we go. Which started three different operations: Moses, Solomon, and Joshua, in which the Israeli government helped to facilitate their migration to Israel, mostly through the Sudan. This journey through the Sudan was quite difficult. People had to go by foot. What I really want to emphasize here is that, or I want to de-emphasize the role of the Israeli government, many of whom within the higher echelons of the Israeli government did not actually want to facilitate that migration, but had to based on the advocacy work of Jews in Ethiopia, North American Jews, and Ethiopian Jewish Israelis, the few that were prevented citizenship. And so it was really through the work, kind of this grassroots effort by Ethiopian Jews and North American Jews that really kind of helped, get them out of the country during this famine. So they needed to walk from Ethiopia to Sudan, which is a very long trek. Thousands of them were placed in refugee camps, mostly in a hostile Christian environment. A lot of the Sudanese Christians were quite anti-Semitic and were not pleased with the presence of Jewish community. Sometimes they faced attacks from these Christian groups. And at some point, migration was halted during the first mission following an international press leak from an Israeli official who kind of intentionally leaked the fact that they were secretly, if you keep in mind, at this point, Sudan and Israel were enemy states, but Sudan helped facilitate this migration. And so once it was leaked, they had to stop it, but then it was then continued through President Bush. In addition to that, they faced sexual assault, improper medical treatment, anti-Semitism, and starvation. And I have pictured here. I found out a lot of information through the Ethiopian Israeli Jewish community who thankfully provided a lot of testimony, thousands of testimonies about people who, their family members who were killed or starved to death during this voyage. And so I've been pouring through about 1,400 different testimonies of this, and I found this really wonderful color image of one woman who did not survive. Only her husband and mother survived this voyage, and not her children either. So moving on to something slightly less depressing than that, are what happens once they migrate to Israel. So for the Ethiopian Jewish community, as I mentioned, they didn't necessarily consider themselves Black in the first generation, but the second generation really does kind of embrace this notion. And primarily that's because of several issues that are faced. One are everyday forms of racism, segregation, police brutality, and surveillance. They're placed oftentimes in the same deprived areas as Mizrahi were placed in the 50s. And there are some tensions between kind of the new Black community of Ethiopians and the old Black community of Mizrahi. Responses to kind of like how they've integrated Blackness within their own framework is kind of a rewriting of Beta Israel history by a lot of young Ethiopian scholars, cultural revival and embrace of global Black identity, and also commemorating the deceased and missing in Sudan, because there are still some people who are missing from that voyage. And I want to kind of conclude with a little bit of some joy here, and kind of thinking through political Blackness. And so pictured here is a group of Mizrahi and Ethiopian youth in Beersheba during a Black Lives Matter protest. As you can see, he wrote it in English. And really think about this notion of political Blackness that is kind of framed within or kind of created within the UK, formulating an alliance between Afro and Asian origin peoples who live in the West. And then trying to see how it applies to the Israeli context. And so doing that, I look at poet Yossi Zabari, who is a queer slam poet, actor, comedian. He does a lot of things. And I was struck by one particular line that he has in a poem called If I Were an Ethiopian, where he talks through that kind of Mizrahi Ethiopian allyship. And the end of the poem ends with Black isn't a color, it's a status. And it's really powerful to me to really think through how scholars have also thought through, what does it mean to be Black in a global sense, not just in the American case, not imposing the American frameworks of race on others, but how other societies actually think about Blackness. And I thought this was a really great, very shorthand poetic notion of that. And what I've been doing recently, this is kind of part of my book project, is kind of thinking through the questions of what does it mean to be Black in the 21st century, so now, and how does it relate to Jewishness outside of that fraught American white-Black relational context? In addition, I want to think through some common refrains that actually happens that renders Mizrahim as singularly and uniquely far right, and think through what is a Jewish queer of color critique that challenges this notion surrounding politics, race, and nationalism under a revisionist regime that's existed for decades now. And where do we find these moments of critique of Israeli society by Israeli Jews in particular? And how does one even document, as a historian, which I am, and historicize something that is kind of like ephemeral in a sense, right? How do we historicize Blackness? And this is a big question that I've been asking myself in the past several years, and I, came to some conclusions that, like, if we privilege the archive, as historians are often trained to do, we, particularly for Black subjectivity, we end up kind of packaging, containing, objectifying, thingifying, and commodifying the Black subject, thus, which would really undo any kind of reparative work that I want to do. It reinforce also the notion that the state and its institutional organs, meaning state archives, are the only truth-telling bodies. They're the only possible way of finding out or telling the truth, even more so than the subjects of whom history I seek to repair. And so this is why I look at, for part of my chapter, look at these testimonies from Ethiopian Jews as well as poetry, to kind of get at what if I listen to the figures that I'm actually, writing about? What do they have to say about questions of Blackness? And so I'd like to share with you a little bit of his poetry. I won't read all of this to you. This is Tamid Rotiti Liot Ashkenazi. I always wanted to be Ashkenazi, which I translate as I always wanted to be white, given how he describes Ashkenaziyut or Ashkenazi identity. And throughout this poem, it's a very long poem. I'm only giving you a very small section of it. He interrogates Israeli whiteness, which is a fairly new thing. It's really oftentimes when we talk about race, we kind of focus, well, what does it mean to be Black? We never really ask the question of what does whiteness actually mean? And so he actually starts the poem with actually doing that and looking at positions of power, what kind of culture is whiteness for the Israeli normative framework, and what are variations of Blackness within Israel. And in another poem, in addition to this one, he also recognizes his own Blackness as a Yemenite origin Mizrahi Jew, but also takes notes of the experiences that are different of Israeli, Ethiopian Israeli Jews, who are also Blackened in a sense, but different in a sense, and they come sometimes at conflict with Mizrahim. So in this poem, what he does is kind of create a Alice in Wonderland fantasy. He starts off with describing whiteness and then goes into kind of really funny notions for himself that, oh, how terrible it must be that I'm born this way and things like that. But then towards the end, he gets into this fantasy of, well, what would happen if I actually turn white in a sense? And so before that fantasy, he uses notions of he talks about his own Black body, where he, quote, finds a white soul imprisoned in a colored body, who, when he looks in the mirror, sees someone who pretends to be a lamb with the skin of a panther. Um, and it's really society at large who imprisons these confused souls, not their body or skin tone. And as I read through his poetry, I kind of was quickly reminded of a poem by Margaret Burroughs, who starts off with, what should I tell my children who are Black, who are faced with the abhorrence of everything that is Black? What does it mean to be captive in this dark skin? And turning from the self-realization of wanting to be white, as he starts off with the poem, he then pivots towards a satirical religious plea in which he bargains with God, that if he were to wake up with blonde or chestnut colored hair, he would even suffer the consequences of a gluten or lactose intolerance, a stereotype associated with Ashkenazim. And continues here. What I show here is this satirical plea that kind of mixes up a vidui, or a religious confession of penitence, of repentance, and an apology for being Black, and showing how it's in dialogue. The poem is in dialogue with both anti-humanist, ontological notions of Blackness in the West, and exegeses from Silihot, or penitential prayers that are said prior to Rosh Hashanah every year. In his request for whiteness, this section here in particular, he borrows freely from the Jewish liturgical poem Lecha Hashem Hatzedakah, righteousness belongs to you, God, recited during Selechot, and says, And in the original prayer, the reciter acknowledges, quote, that the soul belongs to the creator and the body is her handiwork, neshama lach, guf be'olach. Yet they have a shameful face due to sins and hopes that their sins are like crimson. They will turn white as snow and be forgiven. And the prayer leads with the hope that Bavur, for the sake of your name, so you see here, Aseh, that it will make it thusly so. And so he plays on this by saying, oh, yeah, I apologize for being Black in some ways. I hope you make it so that I'll become pure, in a sense. And of course, in a satirical way. And through this, he kind of concludes with an admission that actually, yeah, he maybe always wanted to be white, but forced himself to stop, realizing that his desire was not to be Ashkenazi or white, but to be perceived as human, and Jewish and Israeli Jewish. And rather than being solely defined by others' definitions of Black essence, he recognizes his own body as normal and human. And I wanted to conclude with that and open up with questions and think through, like, what does it mean to be human in that sense? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Roby. That was a fantastic talk, and the gluten reference was particularly rich. That was fantastic. So please submit your questions. It's interesting when I'll start, but please do submit those to the Q&A. I had the same thought when I was reading one of your articles. I was thinking about, the four figures that you mentioned, I believe, are all Chilonim, right?
Yes.
And obviously the founding generation of the state of Israel were Ashkenazi labor Zionists. And the state today looks very, very different than that, of course. And so I think about the ways in which Judaism, broadly conceived, has the capacity both to mitigate racism and also to reinforce racism, right? I mean, so to your point about not recognizing the Jewishness of Ethiopians or of certain Indian Jews or whatever it might be, but there is also sort of the Klal Yisrael concept that is at least theoretically transracial, and so I'm wondering, when we think about this in a non-Chiloni context, when we think about Dati Leumi or Haredi communities, like, how does Blackness function differently in those contexts? And what have you seen, both in terms of the normative discourse of non-Black Jews and in terms of Black Jews within those communities and how they think about their own identities and Blackness?
Yeah, so I'll say that, like, I'll talk about the Haredi community in particular. The Dati Leumi is a little bit more difficult because there's other politics at play, particularly like kind of far right politics that play into kind of like Jewish unity, that I don't want to, that'll be distracting. So for the Haredi community, although there are, many communities that would, really say no, racism is wrong, and that has no place within the Jewish context, whether for Jews or non-Jews. There are also institutional things at play. So, for instance, within Israeli society, Haredi schools for girls are divided by ethnic origin. And oftentimes, Ashkenazi Haredi schools don't allow Sephardic girls to go to their schools. They don't necessarily say because they're Black. They say, well, but they come from a different, less, less educated community of people, right? So they'll kind of dance around it by using other kind of euphemisms for how they associate Blackness with backwardsness, non-Western being, and things like that, even though they all grew up in the same country, oftentimes the same neighborhood, right? And so that's like one thing that comes into play. But there are, of course, other Haredi communities that would, really do kind of like turn to halakhic sources, exegeses as well, to point out that like racism has no place at all within the religious Jewish framework.
And it's interesting. I mean, I guess you don't want to talk about the far right for understandable reasons because it's a different discourse. But it's interesting in the sense that I know the literature that I've read that often that the whiteness or the inclusion of Mizrahim is often defined against an exclusion of Arabs. In other words, that is part of the sort of whitening process. And so that was sort of one of the reasons I was also curious, was thinking about And then obviously tensions over the Arabic language and cultural connections between Mizrahi Jews and potentially two Arabs that was part of a lot of the angst in the early state over those issues.
Yeah, you reminded me of this story of that happened in Beersheba around 1952 or so, where so a lot of the Mizrahim who were living there spoke Arabic and they can kind of understand the neighboring Palestinian communities. And so there was a lot of interaction between them and not much animosity. But what would happen is that police would then come and say, "Well, you don't belong here. This is to Palestinian citizens. You don't belong here. This is like a Jewish neighborhood." And then like tell them to go away, already creating that like kind of division of like um kind of what how people perceived it or how Jewish immigrants perceived it is that, well, if you really want to belong in this country, then that's definitely who you don't want to talk to, right? If the police are coming to tell you not to talk to this person, then that shows you who, where and how you belong or how you kind of should operate within this society. It already tells you that also that something about Arabic, a language that they may have spoken natively, is problematic for them.
Fascinating, fascinating. So we have a few questions that have come in. Emily Hoffman, one of our master's students, asks, have you observed a romanticization of Blackness in Israel, like an exoticization from a political place? I've encountered some Ashkenazi friends saying how cool it would be to be Mizrahi, that I wouldn't be the white colonizer Jew.
So in terms of definitely exoticization, I would say that much. There's a lot of that before and during the state. A lot of the figures that I talked about in the beginning, Nahum Shalush and Ben Zvi, exoticize these communities. Thought of the women as like very very beautiful and exotic. The men also, but kind of stupid. This is how they kind of put it. They're big and beautiful but dumb. Um, that's how they describe them. And you get a little bit of that nowadays in terms of how people, some Ashkenazis say, oh, yeah, it will be really cool because they're like the cool community of Jews in a sense. Not in terms of that colonizing aspect that they want, but more in terms of the cultural aspects. There was this TV show called Osim Mufrechot, I think, that talked a little bit about people who become Mizrahi in a sense. They kind of embrace or appropriate aspects of Mizrahi culture, even though they're Ashkenazi, and it's mostly because they see it as like something not as boring as normative Israeli culture.
Fascinating, fascinating. We have the next was a request, not a question. Is it possible for you to give us a list of historical and literary references, your own work and others? We will. I'll get that information from Professor Roby, and we can put it up on your talk page or something. I think that would be great for people to be able to both. I mean, follow your work and then have you provide further reading that if you're willing to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Rabbi Michelle, who you met during the Ph.D. conversation, asks, Professor Roby quoted another scholar toward the beginning of his talk that Blackness can't be defined by one's skin color. I'm confused as to who a Black Jew is, given that how we define that they come from everywhere from Morocco to India to Singapore. So then how is a Black Jew defined if it's not by one's skin color?
Great question. So I'll start with saying that on one hand, in the beginning, I was talking both about Mizrahim. So in terms of like from Morocco to India to Singapore, that's kind of the Mizrahi framework. But then all of them at certain points were kind of like designated as Black. Even and then within the Mizrahi framework. So I think um, one thing to say, it's very complex and I'm about to confuse you, but it may be helpful. So I'll talk about the Indian Jewish context. Within the Indian Jewish context, you have several different communities of Jews. You have the native Indian Jewish community. You have the Baghdadi Jewish community, who are not just from Iraq, but also from Yemen, Syria, and various other places. And then you also have some from Iran. And what happens is that they are divided, they divide themselves, or the Sephardic community there, and there's also the Sephardic from Spain and Portugal. The Sephardic community divides themselves between themselves, who are designated as white Jews or Gora Jews, and then the Black Jews, the Kala Jews, who are the native Jews. And so that's a designation that existed since at least the 1600s, maybe slightly earlier than that. And that carried over into Israel as well. And so when I talked about, I think in your description, you mentioned that I'm working a little bit on the Indian Jewish civil rights movement that goes on. So that was a transnational movement where the Black Jewish community wanted to then have the same rights as equal Jews, both in India, Pakistan, and in Israel when they were living amongst Israeli. Thanks. And so that's all I'll say. It is complicated. How is a Black Jew defined? It really is about, self-designation. If you think about um, and it has to do with their status. Kind of, it's a both. It's more of kind of a political, existential in some ways, and cultural status that's applied. That in how global blackness is connected, it's mostly has to do with aspects of containment. Oftentimes segregation occurs. It's a shared experience. Affinities with other global Black struggles as well is another aspect, and then a very clear, stark divide between kind of a normative group that sees itself as white, white European, Western, and sees the other group as part of themselves, but very much always underneath them, as a racial other.
It's a
I
great
know
answer.
that's confusing, but that's the best answer I can give.
Oh, that's a great answer, and I think it gets actually one of the conversations we were having earlier with the PhD students about normative discourses defining groups, right? The ways in which, and then, but even if you are defined as a group through the discourse of the majority, when you become to self-identify it with it, to your point, it becomes meaningful in and of itself, which is just an interesting phenomenon in general in multiple societal contexts.
Yes.
Leah Paretsky asked, I wonder how you see the differences in the Israeli communities versus the American communities. American communities have some inherent racism from growing up in the US, I'd assume, but is it the same racial divide that seems to be political because of the state and how it was founded, et cetera?
So I'm assuming you mean Israeli Jewish and American Jewish communities.
I think she's asking how race functions how race functions differently in the American and Israeli context. So as opposed to sort of your framework of global blackness, which makes a very compelling case, there are at least for people who are being empowered through this discourse, a lot of meaning in that shared experience. What are the differences that you see?
Oh, okay, yeah. So the differences, I'll in the American case, generally speaking, one major difference is a big focus on scientific racism. The kind of one drop rule, for instance, which designates someone as Black. Keeping in mind that, I always use Mariah Carey as a kind of great example as a Black woman singer who is, paler than many white people, right? Right, but she is a Black woman. But we imagine that, we imagine a Blackness upon her based upon, ethnic origin, familial lineage, and the one drop rule, right? So that's one thing that really is significantly unique, actually, in the American sense. Very few countries, if any, really have that kind of imagination that the Americans are capable of. Um, and for Jews, really, I would say the American Jewish case, one of the racial divides amongst themselves would be between what people call Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and imagining that the Sephardic community are kind of a new group, although they were, the first Jewish Americans in many ways, as part of the Spanish Empire and things like that. And imagining it just as a religious divide, or religious and cultural. In the Israeli case, there is a mixture of Orientalism, of imagining. So a lot of it has to do with Orientalism and kind of a fear or disdain for Arab culture, oftentimes Arab and Oriental culture, in which there is a divide between Arab and Jew, which didn't exist prior to the state, more or less. And then those who are somewhere in between, those who are Arab Jews or those who are Jews from not Europe, are oftentimes divided racially based along those lines. And so that's how you have, for instance, Jews from definitively European countries who are designated as Mizrahim, so people from Kafkaz or Georgian Jews, which are literally the Caucasus areas, right, are designated as Easterners more so than Russian Jews who come from, all of whom would come from the Soviet Union, but they are racially divided. So there is like kind of this cultural definition that exists that has little to do with kind of blood-based racism, but more importantly is based around how you perform your Jewishness, how you dress, how you talk. Last names sometimes are designators as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. This is a really interesting question again from Emily on the question of intermarriage, quote unquote. And it reminds me of we had a family friend whose son made Aliyah and joined the army, and he started dating an Ethiopian girl, and she said, "Well, it's not as bad as if she was a shiksa." This was the like okay, well, this is the so the question here is do people think of, which is in a racist American context, but still interesting in its whatever nuance.
Yeah.
The question is Ashkenazi Jews marrying non-Ashkenazi Jews or Black Jews? Do people think about that in terms of intermarriage in the same way that there's the discourse around intermarriage in other American and European contexts between Blacks and whites?
Yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon that I really have been trying to unpack. I'm not gonna do it in this book because it's a lot, but what I really want to point out is the wording that's used. So they do refer to it as intermarriage when Ashkenazi and Mizrahi families join, or like one partner is Ashkenazi and one is Mizrahi. But then that word is really just used when you refer to Jews marrying non-Jews. And so where is the intermarriage if it's two Jews marrying each other, right? So it points out the power of that racial framework is already really much in existence. So it is a thing. Children of those marriages are often referred to or refer to themselves as someone who's half-half, hetzi hetzi, basically, right? Which gets into, again, the power of that, how much race and racism has actually, influenced Israeli cultural society within the Jewish community itself, right? In very little parts of Jewish history, which you imagine that, there's a major divide when one Jew marries another Jew, and somehow they're half and half of what? Of Jews? So yeah. So that's something that I do want to address later in my career, but it's something, that is part of the tropes that exist.
That's a fascinating point, and I think I look forward to reading your research on that. We also have a request, which again we can put on your page for more which I also share, which for more poetry, which poets you suggest, and I know this particular student reads Hebrew fluently, and many of our students do on the call. So
Oh, cool! I got tons. Yeah.
yeah. So you should and if any of it's in translation, that's also great. If that's so thank you for that, and we'll end with an uplifting note on and I actually I want to say before we do end that I think what you've done in terms of getting the testimony of Ethiopians who went through the experience in Sudan is incredible, and I think that we all owe you it's really a service to history and to the community to bring those narratives to the fore, and I know it's not easy work, so it's yeah. So thank you for doing that. Steve Pollock asks, you have addressed racial conflicts and segregation in Israel. What contributions have Mizrahim, Afro-Asian Jews made to Israeli culture, music, food, literature, and politics?
Tons. Yeah, I don't know where to start. I mean, there's music, yeah. Food wise, a lot of kind of what is considered Israeli cuisine is actually Mizrahi, particular. So, how couscous, for instance, becomes like an Israeli cultural food is because of North African Jews. Things like that. Music, of course, a lot of the pop music nowadays is influenced by Mizrahi music. um, Literature, there's lots of poetry, as I mentioned, as well. Piyutim, which are kind of liturgical poetry, like Licha Dodi, for instance, is a piyut. That is one aspect of it. In politics, there are now quite a lot of Mizrahi politicians. For better or worse. But historically speaking, there weren't that many because they were not, kind of provided access to parliamentary politics. But nowadays there has been increasing presence of some Mizrahi politicians.
And I should say, I know you mentioned in our other conversation that you were originally thinking about writing about Shas for your
Yeah.
dissertation. So that would have been a very interesting perspective for my first question for you about the role of Judaism as a factor in this sort of larger discourse about Blackness and positionality of those communities. I mean, I don't know if you want to share some thoughts on Shas to not yet. Well, yes, no, that is more than fair.
Absolutely not.
In some cases, the less said, the better. Well, Professor Roby, I cannot thank you enough for joining us. I know many people will listen to this recording later, and I thank all the audience that joined us for this. And sorry, Joe Davis is. This will be the last question. The blurb for the talk mentioned Orit Tashoma and Yossi Zabari. Zabari, you mentioned. Could you say a word about them?
So Zabari, I read some of his poetry. Orit Tashoma is an Ethiopian Israeli poet. She has some really fascinating work that incorporates some jazz elements into her slam poetry. And a really great poem that I've been working on its translation into English. That's called Sorry Mother Ethiopia, where she kind of explores this aspect of not just her Blackness, but her Ethiopianness and Jewishness and how it's intertwined with her Israeli identity. And so she's kind of asserting herself as an Israeli woman and kind of satirically apologizing to Ethiopia because of that in some ways, that she recognizes that Israeli normative identity would deny her, access to an Afro-diasporic identity or Black identity in some ways. But she still wants to keep both of those things. And throughout the poem, she shows how to keep those things as one.
That would be another wonderful thing to share on your list.
Oh, yeah.
That sounds amazing. Okay, well, thank you all, and I hope you enjoyed the talk, and again, thank you, Professor Roby, and we hope to host you again at Gratz, either in person or virtually in the future.
Thanks for having me, Professor Goldman.